Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Name is important.
This, I apologise you haven't had this in advance. It is a work in progress, hence the scribbles. Indeed, calling it a work in progress might be an exaggeration. You could just call it a work. We'll see. So I'm a political theorist, and I'm not sure political theory is the best place to propose any detailed practical policies. And in this paper, I'm not going to provide any detailed proposals of how to practically address the challenges raised by the migration of healthcare workers, which is really what I'm looking at. So what I'm going to do is try and develop a theoretical framework within which to think about those challenges. And that may be what a political theorist does best. So one thing I've learned over the years of doing political theory is that the scope of that theory, the space it provides for practical policy development, is really down to the political theorist, whether it provides only a little change to political practice or whether it's radical or ambitious in scope. There are arguments which are already being mentioned here about the separation of politics and morality, about political realism and ideal and non-ideal theory, that all point to a level of caution about what theory can achieve. We have to be reasonable rather than proposing any radical alternatives to current practice. Those arguments have never made a lot of sense to me. Theories about the use of the imagination to construct alternative possibilities, and for me, in order to test our current practices fully rather than just merely tweak at them a bit, those alternatives should be ambitious and radical. And what we may find is that sometimes, perhaps more often than we think, it's the radical that is the most reasonable. So the theoretical framework I'm going to propose is, I hope, ambitious and radical. It builds on a paper I wrote a few years ago called The Right to Leave versus the Duty to Remain, Healthcare Workers and the Brain Drain. And in that paper I looked at the issue of health worker migration in a human rights framework. But argued that for that approach to work, we needed a moral theory to ground it. The human rights approach itself is not a moral theory. And the moral theory I suggested was cosmopolitanism. And the purpose of this paper is to, the objective of that paper, was to argue against restrictions on labour mobility as a solution to the challenges experienced in source countries in relation to health provision. And in this paper, I want to move on from that debate and explore more fully what cosmopolitan moral framework would look like and what it could do to help us understand the ethical dimensions of health worker mobility, international mobility. But I think let's start in the context of human rights and conceiving of the brain drain. I will talk about brain drain, but always be in snare quotes, so just take that as granted. Conceiving the brain drain issue as a potential clash of fundamental human rights. And that's how Judith Bueno de Mesquita and Matt Gordon approached the issue in their human rights analysis of the migration of health workers. So, as you know, everyone has the right to leave any country, including their own. That right is enshrined in the International Bill of Rights, Article 13 of the Universal Declaration, Article 12 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But Mesquita and Gordon point out that there is a right to health also enshrined in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration and in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And this right to health is understood to be a right to health care. It's a variety of facilities, goods, services and conditions necessary for the realisation of the highest attainable standard of health. So Mesquita and Gordon observe that although the language of human rights is often invoked when considering the right of health workers to freedom of movement, it's less commonly invoked to explore the situation of communities losing access to healthcare services as a consequence of migration. However, posing the brain drain issue as a clash of rights doesn't get us very far, because as Mesquita and Gordon observe, human rights must be considered of equal value. So what we have, looking at this way, is a clash of rights, but no way to resolve that clash. So for Mesquita and Gordon, what we have to do is find a strategy which respects both rights. And so they argue against moves that would restrict freedom of movement of health workers. So states are responsible for protecting and fulfilling human rights, and although health workers are agents of the state, sometimes, not always, this does not place, they say, a personal responsibility on individual doctors, nurses, technical assistants, or other workers to fulfil human rights such as the right to health. So it's not the personal responsibility of health workers to meet the right to health of others. And that's the view the World Health Organization takes in its global code practice. So they say, to quote from the code, or the preamble, the code is based on the rights of all people to the highest attainable standard of health, but it also honours the right of any individual, including health personnel, to leave any country and to migrate to any other country that wishes to admit and employ them. So in my original paper, I argued that a cosmopolitan framework could help us better conceive of the moral dimensions of health worker mobility, in that it takes us beyond national and international solutions towards global ones. And it also prevents us from personalising the issue as a clash of rights between the health worker and the health system user. And in this paper, I'm going to try and fill out some of the detail of that framework. And the essential ingredients are going to be a conception of healthcare as a global public good, a focus on the idea of global solidarity as a foundation for the provision of that global public good, and human rights as the basis of that global solidarity. And also, we need to see the shortage of health workers as a global issue, not a local or regional one, such that we realise that health worker migration isn't the cause of the global shortage of health workers. So regulating migration isn't actually going to be the solution. I want to start with Dev Kapoor and John McHale's question when they asked whether cosmopolitans should worry about the brain drain, and the answer they give is that they should, but they should place it within a development framework. So the right response is not to shut down the one reasonably liberal element of the international migration system, but to look instead for ways to make the system work better for the development prospects of countries from which the skilled workers come. They argue that skilled labour migration has complex effects on development, some of them beneficial, but they do argue that the effects are negative when it comes to health in certain areas, such as the Caribbean and parts of Africa. And they argue that three principles should guide a cosmopolitan response. The first is global liberty, freedom of movement. The second is global efficiency, maximising the global pie of resources. And the third is global equity, promoting equality, or prioritising improvements to the well-being of the least advantaged. What cosmopolitan policies have to do, they say, is seek a better balance between the three principles that currently exists. They should aim, they say, to reduce the harm done by the brain drain without undermining the relatively free movement of skilled individuals. They propose some development strategies which I won't go over because I want to move on to argue that a cosmopolitan framework would go further than the focus on development. So the argument I want to say is we need to move beyond international development towards global solidarity through seeing the shortage of health workers as not their problem, which we can help solve, but as our problem, where the we embraces a global community. And the first element of that cosmopolitan approach is to identify global health as a global public good. There's a lot of literature about the idea of global public goods, which I'm not familiar with, so I'm skating on thin ice. But one writer, Richard Smith, says there are sufficient grounds to regard health as a global public good. So public goods are characterised as being non-excludable and unrivaled in consumption, and therefore there's no private incentive to provide them. They can only arise through public solidarity in some shape or form, and some aspects of health, he argues, are public goods, such as the reduction of the risk of infectious diseases. And some can be characterised as global public goods. So the globalisation of travel, liberalisation of trade have widened the scope for understanding health as a global public good. And he says, look, the central issue for health-related global public goods is how best to ensure that the collective action necessary for health is taken at an international level. Once we recognise that health is a global public good, I think that cosmopolitan ethic has to look towards the conception of global solidarity in order to find solutions with challenges for the provision of that good, such as health, work and recreation. And here I'm drawing on a paper written by Christine, along with Lisa Ekin-Wheeler and Wei Chung, and they emphasise the role of global solidarity in addressing migration and global health inequity. And they work with what they say is a traditional understanding of solidarity as extending identity to include members of the community who are vulnerable, but extending it beyond the national community. And they cite Carol Gold, who describes solidarity as a readiness to establish broad interrelations with a range of others who may or may not be one's compatriots, but who may share in a situation of being oppressed or exploited or suffering through no fault of their own. So solidarity, the feature of solidarity is that it's not self-representation, which is why it transcends national concerns and the nation state. Solidarity isn't about representing yourself, it's about representing others. They're also informed by Iris Marion Young's conception of solidarity as lying beyond sentiment. Rather than affective ties, it's based on the fact that people dwell together within a set of problems and complex causal connections of structural interdependence. So there's an emphasis on interconnectedness through social structures and processes which are transnational and many of which generate injustice. And it's in this sense that we dwell together within a dense relation of global interdependence. And it's this dwelling together, they argue, that's the basis of global solidarity when it comes to health and migration. So we do dwell together. Another set of writers, Julio Frank, Octavio Gomez-Dantes and Sueli Moon, also argue that we need to look beyond national sovereignty towards, and beyond development towards global solidarity. Their focus is on global health, and they argue that it should be reconceptualized as the health of the global population, with a focus on the dense relationships of interdependence across nations and sectors that have arisen within globalization. So it's a manifestation, it's not a manifestation of dependence, and so an issue of development, which is why you have to look beyond development, but it's a manifestation of interdependence, and so an issue of solidarity. And they argue that health interdependence has arisen because many of the determinants of health have been globalized and they flow across borders. And this intensification of cross-border flow has created situations not merely of interconnection, but of this idea of interdependence. So the key idea is that we are interdependent when it comes to health. The difference between interconnection and interdependence is that they say interconnection describes the nature of health threats and effects, whereas interdependence refers to the distribution of power, responsibility, and capacity to respond. So global health challenges transcend the capacity of any one state to address them. And so while traditionally nation states have been responsible for the health of their population, increased interdependence has eroded the capacity for them to meet that responsibility. Now Frank et al. Identify three different frameworks for global transfers of health. The first is development aid, the second is international cooperation, and the third is global solidarity. And each of those has a different set of relationships, stakeholders, motivations, and instruments. So development aid implies a relationship of dependence, with the main actors as donors and recipients, and the main motivations being, well, charity and self-interest, and the main instrument being discretionary aid allocations. International cooperation implies a relation of independence, with the main actors being independent nation states, acting for mutual benefit through pool resources, so maybe bilateral agreements. But global solidarity implies a relationship of interdependence, where the main stakeholders are members of a global society. They're motivated by shared responsibility and by using shared resources based on universal rights and duties. So they say the idea of a global society is based on principles of human rights and the logic of health interdependence. Global solidarity will be based on a widely shared understanding of health interdependence and the acceptance of some responsibility for the health of others as members of the same society. In other words, a shared commitment to realization of health as a human right based on a recognition of a common humanity. And so we return back to human rights. as a basis for approaching this. The fourth element of the cosmopolitan ethic is, as I said before, to conceive of the shortage of health workers as a global issue, not a local or a regional one. So it calls for some degree of global governance as an expansion of global solidarity around health. So we need to stop seeing the shortage of health workers as a problem for 57 countries. 57 is always the number that comes up, because doing so makes the health workers leaving those countries to some degree culpable for the shortages. If we see the shortage of health workers as a global problem, then migration is clearly not the cause of that shortage, and regulating is not the solution. It's a global shortage, so all migration does is distribute the shortage somewhere else. It doesn't create it. So the shortage of healthcare workers is global. The World Health Organization estimates a global shortfall of 4.2 million workers. By 2035, they think a shortfall of 12.9 million. The EU has its own shortfall of around 1 million. In fact, as the UK is now dependent for nearly 40% of its health. That system of global governance might be in the form of a strengthened World Health Organization. And interestingly, the WHO worked with the International Organization for Migration to produce a report in 2013 on international migration, health and human rights. That report didn't address health worker migration, but it is an example of two global institutions coming together to investigate health and migration in a human rights context. However, having said that, there is a concern that whatever global institutions become the framework of governance, there's always a strong possibility that they'll see the issue as one of brain drain and see the solution as being one of more efficient migration management, with health worker migrants seen as commodities for global health in a neoliberal context. In a critical report on the World Bank paper, a group of campaign organisations, including Health Workers for All, warned against looking at health worker migration through an instrumentalist rational economic lens as a free labour market that needs to be better managed in order to achieve more efficient results. What was missing, they said, was any perspective on human rights, health equity, and the perspective of migrant workers. This is basic Kantian ethics. Health workers are ends in themselves, not really means to an end. We tend to take a very instrumentalist view of health workers, but they're just as much ends in themselves as philosophers. So a cosmopolitan ethic with these key ideas of health as a global public good, global solidarity as the foundation for that global public good, and human rights as the key elements for informing global solidarity, provide those missing elements that they're looking for. So for Frank and his co-authors, the global solidarity approach requires a fundamental transformation in terms of the construction of a global civil society with robust global institutions. They say, in a world marked not only by deep inequalities, but also by the acceptance of a set of universal human rights, global solidarity becomes a unifying force to build a global society that could redress those inequities and ensure the realization of those rights. This, they concede, is an idealistic vision, and we might add a radical one, and also theoretically underdetermined. All of the key concepts, global public goods, global solidarity, and indeed human rights, especially both the right to migrate and the right to health, are theoretically as well as politically highly contested. However, if we don't want to see the international labour mobility as an issue of simply resource management, if we don't want to see health worker shortage as an issue of international development aid, and if we don't want to understand these issues through the lens of the nation state and therefore national interest, then we do need an ambitious, overarching moral and political theory which enables us to see them in a radically new way. So I want to finish with 2 points, both of which are where I'm at in my own interests and intentions for thinking about these things. The first is to say that conceiving of international mobility within the cosmopolitan framework actually changes how we understand it. So a right to international mobility looks very different in this context, such that simply opening borders is not sufficient. If it were sufficient, then the cosmopolitan would be just as guilty of characterising labour migrants as a commodity as more neoliberal approaches. Instead, the right to international mobility becomes the right to control when, where, why and how one migrates. The reality is that while many workers are highly mobile under current arrangements, they often have very little control over the when, why, where, and sometimes even the how. As well as some people being trapped where they are, some people are trapped within migration flows. Under those conditions, migration is not the exercise of freedom or agency. So the right to international movement needs to be the exercise of freedom and agency. Secondly, and finally, there's theory itself. What cosmopolitanism ought to provide is an antidote to insider theory, that is, theorising from the inside. The fact is that a great deal of political theory about migration has been insider theory, theorising from inside a nation state and theorising from inside a particular kind of nation state. This kind of theory constructs the migrant, whether an immigrant or an emigrant, as aberrant, as a problem that has to be solved on behalf of the citizen, and it ignores the fact that it's the citizen that often constitutes a problem for the migrant. Cosmopolitan theory has therefore to provide space for the insider and the outsider, the citizen and the migrant, to be equally valid and value contributors to theory, with no voice privileged over the other. In fact, it needs to not construct them as insider and outsider. So what I'm getting at here is the topology of theory. Theory has a topology. It has a space in which certain spaces are constrained or not constrained. So we need to think about the topology of theory itself, the geography of theory. And so what emerges is the need for theory itself to be transformed, and we need a distinctive view of freedom, a distinctive view of human rights, a distinctive view of global mobility, a distinctive view of the border. The theoretical basis for discussions about the ethics and problems and policies of mobility must itself be transformed. So political theory is not a fixed framework. Political concepts are not fixed points. What freedom means, what human rights mean, has to be fought over. It always has been. So the fight is not over. So the fight is not just for freedom or for human rights. It is also about their meaning, and that has always been the case. And what we need to realise is that their meaning will not be determined only by theorists or policymakers, but also by migrants themselves acting these ideas out. What we need is a dialectic between theory and the lived experience. Sorry about the slightly nervous presentation.